Bottom of the ninth, 2 outs. The game seems all but lost, but just then the man they call arrives. The gentleman batter. His baseball bat isn't just sports equipment. Strange power is hidden within it, which begins to manifest when monsters from another world appear. And every hit of his is no longer just a home run, but a true battle for survival. The protagonist's name is Dan, and instead of a normal sports career, he ends up embarking on a dangerous adventure to find his way back home and discover why he was given this power. And honestly, the combination of baseball and monster fighting sounds pretty crazy on its own. But that's precisely why stories like these tend to be very interesting. This content is an original narrative retelling by the channel author, created with a unique style, structure, and approach. It does not reproduce the original material verbatim and constitutes a transformative work. In the temple, there is a painting of the gods hanging on the wall next to a large statue. A man in a baseball uniform looks at them in silence, and somehow he seems hopeful. This here is the main protagonist of our story. Someone calls out to Dan, causing him to turn around. It's the monk. The monk asks if he's going to the game. Dan nods and says, if today is the finals. The monk smiles and teases him. If you lose, you should shave your head and become a monk. Dan, honestly, doesn't know if the monk is cheering him on or preparing to recruit him. Suddenly, someone comes running in, calling out to their older brother. A half-asleep teenage girl appears, brushing her teeth as she walks. She looks at him, squinting, and asks if he's leaving already. Dan seems confused and asks why she's up so early. She tells him to hold out his hand and drops a small keychain into his palm. Dan stares at it, completely bewildered. She gets annoyed and explains that, obviously, it's a very cute doll. It's a little blue bear with white horns, thick eyebrows, and small, sharp fangs. Dan isn't sure if cute is the right word, which only annoys her further. She quickly apologizes, saying she's not good at crafts, and tells him to just consider it a lucky charm. Or something like that. Dan asks if she made it herself, and the question immediately makes her blush. He thanks her, and promises to take good care of it. He then pats her head and teases her for suddenly doing such thoughtful things. She immediately retorts that she hasn't even washed her hair yet. Dan jumps back and shouts that his hand is going to rot. He even asks the monk to purify her. She kicks him and tells him to just leave already. Their little argument is, honestly, hilarious. But then the monk calls out to Dan again. Both of them stop. The monk tells Dan in a low voice to come back safe and sound today too. Dan simply smiles and assures him not to worry. He promises to return after winning big. The monk believes him. After all, Dan will return victorious. At the stadium, the announcer's voice boomed across the field. Bottom of the ninth inning. 2 outs, bases loaded, the score was tied. Whoever won this game would take home the high school baseball championship. Everyone held their breath, wondering if Guangdong High could survive this crisis. Player Kemdian approached the plate, gripping his bat tightly. The announcer reminded the audience that Kim Dan was someone special. People already considered him the greatest baseball prospect in all of Korea. The pitcher began his wind-up. The tension between the players was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The first pitch shot out of the pitcher's hand. The ball blazed past at a dizzying speed. Dan prepared his swing and swung the bat, connecting cleanly. The ball zipped past the pitcher like a gust of wind. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The ball soared higher and higher. A glove shot up and caught it, but it wasn't a player. It was someone from the audience. The stadium erupted in cheers. Home run. Kim and Dan had done it. The announcer shouted that Dan was truly an incredible player. Watching him reminded him almost of his own playing days in America. And with that final hit, Dan defeated the one-down guy to become the champion. They even prepared an exclusive interview with their star player. That night, after winning the high school tournament, Dan had one thing clear. His chances in the upcoming draft had skyrocketed. Still, he had a small regret. He had forgot to buy rice cakes on the way home. Meanwhile, the monk was getting old. Did rice cakes suit him? But honestly, since Dan was the one who won the championship, shouldn't they be the ones buying him fried chicken? Suddenly, Zaz. He got hit on the back of the head. It was his sister. She complained that he was walking slower than a snail. Then she asked him what he was thinking about so seriously. Unfortunately for Dan, his peaceful victory walk had just turned into a sibling interrogation. He was surprised. He told her to stick her head out. She stuck out her tongue and threatened to tell the monk if he hit her. So he changed tactics and instead teased her by asking if she had even washed her hair. She immediately shouted that she had. They continued walking together. She told him that her school had broadcast the baseball game during class. And when he hit the home run, every classroom had cheered so loudly that the school started receiving complaints. Dan swelled with pride and said it was only natural. After all, an unparalleled genius had just appeared in Korea. She rolled her eyes and said he owed it all to the lucky charm she had given him. Dan responded with a very sarcastic, "Yeah," and she immediately said that meant he owed her something next time. Dan told her he was already starving, so they had better hurry back home and eat, and since he was the one who won the game, he expected her to do the dishes that night. She complained that doing the dishes had absolutely nothing to do with baseball. When they arrived at the temple, Dan pushed the door open and announced loudly that he was back. But through the small opening, he saw something strange. The monk lay on the floor, and in front of him was a man in a red cloak. Dan leaned forward, trying to get a clearer look. At the same time, his sister froze. She pushed the door open wider and asked him why he wasn't coming in. Then she saw it too. She went pale. As she screamed the monk's name, Dan's heart sank. The man calmly said that this had nothing to do with him, but Dan didn't believe a word of it. He lunged towards him and swung his bat, but the man dodged the attack with ease. Then he slowly turned his gaze back to Dan. Dan yelled at Kim Yen to run. She hesitated, clearly worried about him, but he yelled at her again to hurry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she finally took off running. Dan's mind raced. Who was this man, and what was he doing here in the temple? And more importantly, what had happened to the monk? He prayed that the old man wasn't dead yet. At this moment, there was only one thing he had to do: take down the man first. At least he was lucky in one thing. The intruder didn't seem to be carrying any weapons. The man calmly said that he would like to explain everything. But unfortunately, he didn't have much time left. He apologized for bringing things to this point. He then pulled out a crystal, and suddenly it began to glow with an intense light. Dan's eyes widened. Alarmed in the blink of an eye, the man disappeared. The next instant, he had already closed the distance and hit Dan before Dan could react. The man pressed the glowing crystal against his chest, and then called Dan by his name. He told him to look for any air. Dan froze because when he looked closely, the man's face was exactly the same as his own. Then suddenly, he felt as if the ground shattered beneath his feet, and Dan began to fall. He was completely confused. The ground crumbled, and his body continued to fall into darkness. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His consciousness began to fade slowly, but he fought desperately against it. Jaina and the monk were still behind him. He couldn't pass out now. When he opened his eyes again, the sight before him chilled him to the bone. There was a skull on the ground, and inside it a centipede writhed. Dan screamed. That creepy skeleton made his hair stand on end. Why would something like that be here? And more importantly, where exactly was he? It seemed he had fallen into some kind of strange cave. His hand brushed against something near him. When he looked down, his heart nearly stopped completely. It was an egg, and inside the egg a centipede writhed. Dan felt a wave of horror wash over him. Then he looked around. There were eggs everywhere. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound. One of the eggs broke open. A limb slowly emerged from the shell. Then the rest of the creature crawled out. It had multiple legs and a mouth full of sharp teeth. The spider began to crawl directly towards him and around him. The other eggs began to hatch as well. Dan froze in terror. He had no idea what was happening anymore. The creature suddenly lunged and sank its fangs into his shoulder. The venom coursed through his veins. Dan screamed and shook off the spider. He groaned in pain as his arm burned as if it were on fire. What the hell were these bugs? More of them began to crawl towards him. Luckily, his bat had fallen with him. He quickly grabbed it and swung it at the bugs to keep them at bay. But he knew he couldn't fight off so many at once. He had to get out of there first. Dan ran as fast as he could, with the bugs chasing him. He kept running, even though he had no idea where he was. He had to find a place to hide first. The bugs were fast, too fast. Then he realized he was inside a huge cave. His eyes widened as the insects closed in. He had no other choice. Dan jumped into the lake and splashed into the water, his head sticking out above the surface. He felt relieved when the insects stopped at the shore. They couldn't enter the water. But then a sharp pain shot through his leg. Some writhing bugs had latched on. Dan quickly ran to the shore and tore them off his legs. They were leeches. He sighed in frustration. There were monsters literally everywhere, and now he seriously wondered where the hell he had ended up. Dan had spent his whole life playing baseball, but he had never seen or heard of anything like it. That made him wonder if he was still in the same world. Suddenly, his hand touched something soft. To his surprise, it was the charm his sister had given him. It was worn out. Its right eye was missing. And a horn. He frowned, wondering how it had ended up there. Maybe it had been in his pocket the whole time. Then he thought of Yana. He also wondered if the monk would be safe. And of course, He remembered that punk who dared to mess with them. But Dan forced himself to stop thinking about it. Panicking wouldn't fix anything. He took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. At this moment, the best he could do was act. There had to be a way out. Now that he had calmed down a bit, he decided to examine his surroundings. He didn't know that a creature was already behind him. Its poisonous saliva dripped onto his bat, and that's when he realized. A huge monstrous spider was right there. Dan froze. The spider suddenly attacked, forcing him to dive to the ground to dodge it. He rolled quickly and turned around, just in time to see what was chasing him. He knew one thing for sure: he had to run. Luckily, he noticed something crucial. Instantly, he spotted a narrow crack in the cave wall. Dan ran towards it. He was almost there. The small opening was right in front of him, but the spider's leg was only a few inches away. It almost bit him. Luckily, he managed to squeeze inside, and the spider was too big to follow him, but he relaxed too soon. The creature pushed one of its legs through the crack, pinning it between his feet. It tried to drag him out. Luckily, it couldn't reach him. Dan trembled as he stared at the monster's mouth, filled with rows of sharp teeth. After a moment, the spider finally retreated and crawled away. Dan let out a shaky sigh. For a second, he really thought he was going to die. Then he noticed something strange. His arm had turned purple, and the veins were bulging under his skin. It must have been the venom from the bug earlier. Worse still, he couldn't even feel his arm anymore. As if things weren't bad enough already, his life was hanging by a thread, and now his arm was also practically useless. Still, he couldn't hide there forever. Dan slowly peeked out of the crack. He scanned the cave, trying to decide what to do next. Then he noticed something. A faint light, and standing in front of it, the silhouette of a person. Dan immediately called out to them, shouting that he was here. Relief flooded his chest. He thought he had been completely alone down there. But as the person approached, Dan finally saw their face, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. Dan saw that it was a skeleton with a spider on its head. He froze, realizing it wasn't a person at all, but another monster. Then it tried to bite him. Luckily, he managed to dodge it. As the skeleton fell face down, he finally clearly saw the spider, its tail-like appendage. It was driven straight into the skull, like a parasite controlling the body. He gripped his bat tightly. Whatever that thing was, if he crushed it, it should die. But he was in for a surprise. The bat snapped in half. Instead, the enraged bug turned towards him. The skeleton lunged forward and bit Dan on the shoulder. He groaned in pain. He tried to shove it away, jammed the broken bat handle into its mouth, and pushed it back. It shook off the bat and lunged at him again. He froze in horror as it grabbed his face. It tried to bite his head off, but he blocked it with his arm. Instead, it bit his arm. He groaned in pain and with his other hand fumbled for something on the ground. He managed to grab a rock and smash the skeleton with it. The skeleton collapsed to the ground. Then he lunged forward to finish it off, continuing to hit it with the rock. The sound of crunching echoed through the cave. The skull with the parasite shattered, and that left him completely exhausted. But as soon as he finished, more monsters appeared. At this point, he was thoroughly fed up. Different monsters crawled out of the darkness. All the undead had parasites attached to their skulls. Now his anger made him want to see it through, and he took off running. He lunged forward at the same time. The monsters pounced on him. Dan hit the monsters. A skeletal dog-like monster bit his calf. He gritted his teeth against the pain. He fought back by elbowing the skeleton. But there were still more. An undead humanoid lunged at him. It knocked him to the ground and tried to bite his face off. Luckily, he managed to push it away before the others could reach him. Out of nowhere, he heard someone say it was fun. His eyes widened. He looked towards where the voice came from and saw it was his Lucky Charm doll speaking. He stared at the doll in disbelief. He couldn't believe it was talking. For a moment, he wondered if he had finally gone mad. He asked it what it was. The doll turned to Misty and calmly said it didn't matter. Dan was about to die, so if he grabbed it, he would live. He asked what that meant. Just then, it was as if time had slowed down. The voice urged him to hurry because the monsters were approaching. He ran as fast as he could towards the blue flame, with the monsters chasing right behind him. He was almost there. A monster was about to grab him, but his hand touched the mistrapped doll first, and a bright light erupted. Thanks to that light, the monsters couldn't get close to him. He found himself holding the mist in his hand, his eyes burning with blue flames. At first, he didn't understand what weapon was forming in his hand, but it slowly took the shape of a baseball bat. He felt a little disappointed. Of all things, it was just a baseball bat. The monster shrieked loudly and lunged at him. Dan's anger finally erupted. He swung the bat with all his might, and the monster's body exploded from the impact. He blinked, stunned by what had just happened. Only the monster's legs were left on the ground. He could feel power coursing through his body. Maybe it was because of the bat. He had no idea what was happening. But with it, he felt like he could defend himself. Where he was, or what the bat really was, or why he had to go through all this, none of that mattered anymore because now he would crush every last one of them and survive. The corpses of the monsters were scattered everywhere, and most of them were mangled. At this point, Dan was already breathing heavily. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His bat was extraordinary. He could feel power flowing through his entire body. He wondered if it was some kind of magic, but then the bat suddenly turned into mist. He stared at it, stunned. The mist gathered and transformed into some kind of strange creature. The truth is, it scared him. Then he turned to the monster's corpses. Dan had no idea what he was seeing. The creature began to devour the monsters. It floated around, consuming every single corpse, and when it finished, it began to glow brightly. Then it returned to Dan's hands. It had turned back into a baseball bat. Suddenly, his heart sank. Our boy experienced the most unbearable pain he had ever felt in his life. He doubled over in pain. He had no idea why this sudden pain had befallen him. Then he realized something strange was happening to his body. The wound on his arm had disappeared. And it wasn't just his arm, even the small scratches were gone. Everything had healed instantly, and somehow he felt stronger. He wondered if it was the power of the bat. He thought it was incredible. With this, maybe he would actually survive. But his stomach rumbled loudly. He was starving. Then he saw some glowing mushrooms nearby. He stared at them and thought for a long time. At this moment, the mushrooms were the only thing he could eat. But the monsters were dangerous. Those mushrooms could be poisonous. Still, he made a decision. He was going to eat them. He'd rather risk poisoning himself than starve to death slowly. Dan took a bite and his eyes widened. To his surprise, they were actually delicious. The gamble had paid off, and he regained his strength. Truthfully, it would not have been surprising if he had fallen ill at any moment. That he would have fallen ill at any moment. He was glad to have food sorted for the moment. After that, he headed to the puddle of water. There were leeches in it, but at least it was drinkable. Still, it grossed him out. Truthfully, it would not have been surprising if he had fallen ill at any moment. But perhaps due to the bat's influence, he came out practically unscathed. Even the brutal survival in the cave became more bearable thanks to that mysterious power. Just as he was starting to adapt to life in the cave, the monsters that kept hounding him reminded him that this was not the world he had lived in before. Those insects, which seemed to parasitize the corpses of other creatures, had hard shells, but their weak points were easy to reach. Taking them down wasn't too difficult, though that was entirely thanks to the bat. Once he killed the monsters, the bat devoured the remains, and when it returned to him, his body healed and grew even stronger. In that way, he slowly adapted to this hell, regaining hope and the confidence that he could survive. That is, until he ran into someone. Countless dangers lurked in this dark place, but the most dangerous of all was undoubtedly that enormous monster. Fortunately, it only prowled near the nest occasionally. It didn't seem to be making any other moves. He wandered the cave for a long time while avoiding it, but he couldn't find any exit. Finally, he came to a conclusion. The exit had to be on the opposite side of the nest, where he had started. The problem was that he would have to go through that hell, even if he could face the insects and the smaller monsters. He wondered if he could overcome that enormous monster. Besides that, he wondered if he would ever be able to return to his family. The thought of being trapped in this hell forever dampened his spirits. He also wondered how he had ended up in this place. And why the man in the robe from before looked so much like him. He remembered the man telling him to find something. He fought against these painful thoughts, but after a while he stopped thinking about it. Since it wouldn't help him survive, he decided to focus on getting out of there. He kept walking through the cave, until he reached the place where it had all begun. The bugs were still hatching from the eggs. He looked around carefully, and realized that the giant monster wasn't there. Only the smaller ones, and they didn't seem particularly restless either. That made him believe he could do it. He stepped on a bone and it crunched loudly. That made him freeze. He slowly turned his head. He sighed in relief when nothing appeared. He assumed the monster simply hadn't heard him. He trembled like a leaf but still managed to reach the other side safely. Dan moved on, hoping to leave all this behind soon, because he was going to get out of there. He finally reached a part of the cave where the ceiling had a large opening through which light entered. There were also eggs scattered in the area. He couldn't see a clear path outside, which made him wonder if this was a dead end, but the light seemed to be coming from outside. He thought about climbing up there, but then he stepped on something and that startled him. It made a loud noise, so he slowly looked down. Unfortunately, he was right on top of the enormous monster's body, and he had just attracted its attention. The enormous monster attacked him and slammed him to the ground. The impact made him cough up blood. It hurt a lot. He cursed inwardly. Then he realized something. This was the enormous monster's nest. The creature lunged at him, ready to devour him. Dan felt horror creep up his spine as he struggled to get to his feet. He quickly raised his bat. He swung with all his might so the monster couldn't reach him. The bat struck the monster's limb. Green blood splattered. For a moment, Dan became a little arrogant. This fight seemed different from their first encounter. The enormous monster clearly didn't like that. It lunged at him again, but Dan could read its movements. He had always relied on his kinetic vision. Still, this monster was on another level. He blocked its attacking limbs. The enormous monster let out a loud shriek. Dan kept watching it intently. When he saw the wound on its limb, he was relieved to see that his attack had worked. Now he knew something important. He could win. The monster suddenly opened its mouth and let out a terrifying roar. Dan paled. The ground began to shake. Small spiders like insects swarmed towards them. There were so many they almost looked like a giant creature. Dan could only think of one thing. This was completely unfair. He gripped his sword tightly and then smashed the insect-like spiders. He glanced back and hit more bugs trying to sneak up behind him. One of the bugs fell on its back. By then, Dan was breathing heavily. The corpses of the bugs were scattered around him, but more small bugs kept coming out alongside the enormous monster. They seemed endless. Suddenly, something moved quickly. Dan's eyes widened. The next instant, the monster's limb pierced his chest from side to side. He gritted his teeth and endured the pain, struggling to break free. A groan of pain escaped his mouth, but he kept gripping the bat tightly. Then he hit the limb with all his might to try and break free. The branch broke, causing the monster to shriek loudly. Finally, the branch that had pierced his chest was torn out, but Dan was bleeding profusely. He looked terrible, and there were still so many monsters in front of him that his vision began to blur. He wondered if it was because he had lost too much blood. He started to feel dizzy. He wondered if this was all he could do. He didn't think he could win like this at all. He knew there was nothing else he could do. He wondered what he was supposed to do. Suddenly, he heard someone tell him to fight. When he looked up, he saw Jaina. She told him not to even think about giving up. He was about to ask her questions, but she interrupted him and told him to get up. She told him that she and the monk were waiting for him. She urged him to hurry, get up, and fight. That brought him back to reality. He turned around and picked up his baseball bat. He moved quickly as the small insects swarmed him. The creature inside the baseball bat revealed its misty form. It glowed brightly. Its face covered the right side of Dan's face. He muttered that he was absolutely fed up with the bugs. Now he took a step forward to face the enormous bug. He charged at it as he ran, a blue-green mist trailing. Behind him, he grabbed his baseball bat with both hands and swung it with all his might. The blow tore off one of the monster's arms. After that, the right side of his face returned to normal. The enormous monster collapsed. Some debris fell from the ceiling. Sunlight streaming through the hole above illuminated the dismembered corpse. Dan was baffled by how he had suddenly become so strong. Finally, Dan was leaving this place. His bat turned back into mist. This surprised him, but he assumed it was going to eat the corpse again. He felt disgusted watching it eat. No matter how many times he saw it, he couldn't get used to it. When it finished, the mist swirled around him. He stared stunned when it suddenly invaded his body. He grabbed his shoulder tightly. Shortly after his wound healed, he liked that it was healing, but he still couldn't get used to the pain. More importantly, with the power he now had, he realized he was on a completely different level compared to when he absorbed those other monsters. That made him think that his power gets stronger the stronger his opponent is. He seemed serious. He might not know what awaited him outside the cave, but he was confident that, with his power, he would somehow manage. He walked out and was surprised by what he saw. It was a desert. A desert wasn't exactly an ideal place, but it was still 1,000 times better than that damp cave. A few minutes later, he fell to his knees. His lips looked dry and cracked. He quickly realized he had made a mistake. That place was more desolate than he had expected. There was no food or water. The only thing he ran into from time to time were walking skeletons. But they didn't surprise him anymore. After fighting so hard to survive, he might end up starving to death. Instead of feeling weak, he lay down on the ground. There wasn't a soul in sight. The only thing resembling a human around him were monsters. He began to think that perhaps this was a world where humanity had already perished. He closed his eyes, hoping that the next time he opened them, everything would turn out to be a dream, Suddenly, someone shouted that there was a person. That woke him up. A middle-aged man told the humanoid fox, Chloe, not to approach Dan. She replied that that person was still alive. Dan was surprised. A moment later, Chloe seemed annoyed. Dan was crying tears. She told him to stop crying. But he just couldn't. He was so relieved to have found them. They were the first people he had seen since arriving there, and they could talk to him. He cried so hard that, honestly, it was quite pitiful. The man told him to calm down so they could talk. Chloe couldn't believe he would say that when they still had a long way to go. He told her to look how happy the boy was. They couldn't just ignore him. Besides, she was the one who ran first because she saw he was alive. That made her blush. In the end, she agreed with him. He told her it had been the right decision. They set up camp and cooked food over a campfire. The pot smelled wonderful. Dan stared at it. It had been a long time since he had seen real food. Chloe commented that he was acting like someone who hadn't eaten for days. Dan replied that he hadn't eaten anything for over 5 days. She was surprised to hear that. She asked him if it was even possible to survive that long. Dan said he wasn't entirely sure, but he believed it was because he had been absorbing those monsters. The man said it sounded like some kind of magic he had never heard of. Dan was surprised to hear that magic existed in this world. Chloe found it hard to believe. She asked him where he came from. Dan admitted he didn't know where to start explaining. The man told them to eat first. They could hear his story while they ate. When they finished eating, they learned that Dan came from another world and had simply woken up there, and that every time he killed monsters with his blunt weapon, his body healed and grew stronger. They found it a very strange ability. Chloe noticed how quiet the undead were that night. Dan said he had wiped them all out with his bat. HL was surprised to hear that, but deep down, the man knew something important. The undead in that place used to resurrect every night, no matter how many times they were destroyed. And yet, the undead that Dan had absorbed remained motionless even after nightfall. He wondered if there was something special about that strange weapon. He silently observed Dan. Then he told Dan that, thanks to him, he could finally get some proper sleep. For once, he suggested that if Dan didn't have a destination in mind, he should travel with them, and that he would help him find a way back to his original world. Chloe couldn't believe Aries had just said that. Aries looked Dan directly in the eyes. Dan looked back at him. Then Dan said he would be grateful. Chloe could only sigh. The next day, she was collecting cacti. She put them in her small bag. Dan learned from her that they were actually edible. He complimented her on knowing so much. She replied that it was just basic knowledge for surviving in such an arid desert. Dan stared at her with a big smile on his face. She asked him why he was looking at her like that. He said she reminded him of his little sister when she was young. Chloe told him she was already an adult. So Dan joined Chloe and Aries' group. As they walked, they chatted for a while. Dan asked Chloe if her ears were real. Then she asked him if people in his world didn't have them. He said no. As he traveled with them, he gradually learned many things about this world thanks to Chloe, who introduced herself as a beast. He learned common sense and the knowledge needed to survive. She asked him what kind of races lived in his world. Dan replied that there were only humans, which made her exclaim how boring. She ran to Aries when they caught up. A middle-aged man named Aries. Dan learned about the ecology of monsters and their fighting style. They both also told him that they had come there to kill the monster leader. Dan felt incredibly lucky, even though he didn't know much about the people in this world. But he had one thing clear. He had met some really good people. Later that night, he held his lucky charm in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking. Aries asked him if he couldn't sleep. Apparently, he had come to see how he was doing. Dan admitted that he had a lot on his mind. Aries asked if he was thinking about home, and said he was curious about it too. After all, he had been living in this world for a long time. But Dan was the first person from another world he had ever met. Dan replied that compared to this world, his own was quite boring, which led Aries to conclude that it must be a very peaceful world. Dan could only smile. He suddenly realized how peaceful his former home truly was. The life he once considered miserable would be considered a luxury in this world. He even started talking about baseball with Aries. Dan made a firm decision to do whatever it took to return. The next day, a monster resembling a large dragon was chasing us. Dying was definitely not part of his plan. Dan and Choi ran. He told her to go first. She worried about him, but he insisted she hurry, gripping his baseball bat tightly, and smashed it into the dragon's face, the blow causing it to struggle to open its right eye. Dan had put all his strength into that attack. The dragon grew angry, lunging at him, causing him to scream loudly. He was sent flying. The explosion caused Chloe to turn around. Dan writhed in pain, glared angrily at the monster. The dragon lunged at him. Trying to devour him, he panicked. But suddenly the enormous monster was cut from top to bottom. From mouth to the ground, and then it collapsed to the ground. Ares had done it. He asked Dan if he was okay. Chloe immediately scolded him for being late. She asked Dan if he was injured. Dan said it was nothing serious. His baseball bat began to glow. The creature came out and began to devour the monster. Dan and Chloe's eyes widened. In surprise, then Dan's injuries began to heal. Soon he seemed to be fine again. Chloe asked what that thing was. She asked if it was the absorption he had mentioned earlier. And Dan said that it basically was. Ares watched as the corpse and its mana vanished without a trace. Dan and Chloe cheerfully talked about what had just happened. But Ares seemed serious. In a firm voice, he called Dan by his name and told him there was something he wanted Dan to do. Dan and Chloe listened attentively. Later that night, Chloe screamed that he was crazy, but Ares seemed completely serious. She was furious because he was basically telling Dan to fight a lick. That was the same as telling him to die. The two talked away from Dan, but Chloe kept shouting. She reminded Ares that killing him according to the original plan should have been enough. Ares replied that if Dan refused, he wouldn't force him. She continued to raise her voice, saying that that idiot didn't even know how strong a lick really was. Suddenly, Dan interrupted her, saying that he would do it. Chloe was shocked. She was completely speechless. Dan asked what he had to do first. While they were eating dinner, they heard Ares. Chloe asked him what exactly they had to check. He explained that, as Chloe had said, Dan didn't fully understand his own abilities yet. Dan admitted that that was true. So before facing the lick, they had to figure out what his abilities were in detail, how they worked and what their limits were. Dan was also curious about that. He also wanted to know what kind of power his bat really had, so he asked what they were going to do. The next day, he looked quite silly sitting there. He had a bored expression. He asked what they were doing. Chloe told him it was a mana scanner. She got excited thinking that maybe he had mana too, but they could only guess, since technically, everyone has mana anyway. Ares told him that he would just take a quick look, and maybe they would discover something about the strange weapon. And Dan's mana. Dan suddenly blushed and covered his body. Ares quickly said it wasn't that kind of inspection. He placed a hand on Dan's shoulder and began to channel mana. Ares closed his eyes, and then his consciousness was pulled to another place. In front of him was a misty, evil figure. Suddenly, a powerful wind blew, forcing him to pull his hand away from Dan's shoulder. He looked stunned. Dan asked him if he was finished yet. He asked if Ares had discovered anything. Ares said no. Unfortunately, he had no idea. Dan simply said, "What a shame." But deep down, Ares knew it wasn't normal mana at all. He felt as if something else was living inside Dan's body. The mere feeling of that mana caused him strong repulsion. He already realized that that power was dangerous. Under the bright sky, a skeleton was wandering. It sensed something and looked around. Suddenly, a small pebble hit it squarely in the face and it collapsed. Quite some time had passed since Dan fell into this world. He didn't know the exact number of days, but he estimated that more than 3 months had passed. During that time, he had absorbed countless monsters. His body had already far surpassed that of an ordinary human. Someone called him. Although the place was filled with unknown monsters, he had managed to hold on because he wasn't alone. Chloe told him it was time to eat. Our protagonist happily finished his meal. He said it had been a great meal. He complimented Chloe on her incredible cooking. She swelled with pride and said it was just a basic skill. Dan asked if they could also look forward to dinner. She told him he would be surprised. Ares realized something. Dan got along surprisingly well with children. He watched as Dan naturally left the dinner preparations to Chloe. Ares asked him if what he had been teaching him was going well. Dan asked if he meant the mana manipulation training. He admitted that it wasn't going as well as he had hoped. He still felt nothing of what he thought he might because, quite simply, he had no talent. Ares thought to himself that it was just as he expected. It had probably been too much to expect that. He had also realized that Dan didn't seem to have any aptitude for magic. Just like him, Ares told him not to get too discouraged, as he was already under the influence of mana. He told him that if Dan continued to try, maybe one day he would be able to control mana. Dan smiled and said that even if he couldn't use mana, he had become quite strong. He hoped he could be of help when they fought the lick, or whatever it was, but both Chloe and Ares fell silent upon hearing that. Then Ares spoke. He told Dan that there would be no situation where he would have to fight the lick directly. That left him completely confused. Ares explained that, from a normal perspective, Dan might seem strong enough, but he was not yet at the necessary level to face a lick. His role was simply to absorb the corpse after Ares defeated it. Dan replied that he understood. Ares added that it was for his safety, so he shouldn't worry too much about it. He told Dan that they would reach their destination in a few days, so he should get enough rest. Dan replied, yes, they continued their journey. At night, they fought the undead and then had dinner. The next day, they continued walking and fighting, and at night they rested while Ares stood guard. Another day passed, and Chloe said she was already exhausted. Ares told her to hold on a little longer. Once they reached the end of the canyon, the entrance to the tomb would be there. Dan offered to carry her backpack. She put on his backpack and simply said, let's go. That made her smile. They traversed the canyon. Chloe seemed hopeful. Ares confirmed that she was right. Dan seemed nervous. Finally, they reached the Lick's tomb. They entered and went down some stairs. They arrived in an empty room. Dan said the inside was cleaner than he expected. Chloe replied that that sounded sinister somehow. Ares warned them not to let their guard down, as it was the kind of place where something could appear at any moment. Dan teased him, asking if he really thought a ghost would appear, or something like that. He paused for a moment. Then he joked, saying he already knew what Ares would say next, that it was right behind him. But the joke backfired because there really was a ghost there, and it replied that it had caught him. Dan screamed very loudly. The ghost said hello, but Dan instinctively hit it. He cursed at it for scaring him. Chloe asked if it was really possible to hit a ghost with a bat. Dan replied that what really mattered was having the determination to hit it. As they explored the tomb, Dan asked Ares what kind of person a Lick was. Ares was silent at first. Then he said that a Lick was the ruler of the land of the dead. He resurrects and commands countless undead. When they entered another room, an undead suddenly appeared and surprised him. Ares continued to say that if a Lick resurrected and fully regained his strength, he would lead an army of undead to destroy the world. That's why they had to defeat him before he regained his power. However, even if they defeated him, he would resurrect again in 100 years due to magic. That was until Ares saw Dan's ability. If Dan could completely absorb and destroy the undead, then maybe it would be possible to finish off their master as well. Dan looked at him with wide eyes after hearing that. Then he said that maybe it wouldn't be that difficult. However, he wasn't sure if the bat would work as they hoped. It didn't absorb all monsters, and he didn't really understand how it worked either. But he believed they would figure it out somehow. He wasn't paying attention to where he was walking. Chloe and Ares saw what was in front of him and became worried. Chloe told him to wait. Dan was bewildered. He turned around and asked why they weren't coming. Suddenly, Ares yelled at him to get out of there. Immediately, a magic circle began to glow. Dan had no idea what they were talking about. And then he disappeared. Chloe and Ares froze. They were horrified. Dan was no longer with them. The hallway was silent, until suddenly, someone ran past at full speed. It was Ares, and Chloe was in his arms. She asked him why the hell he was in such a hurry. She demanded to know what had just happened back there. Ares looked tense. He blamed himself for not thinking things through. Something like that could happen at any moment in that place. He could only hope he hadn't been too late. Meanwhile, Dan fell to the ground. He wondered what that light moments ago had been. He looked around, having no idea where he was. Then he saw something in front of him that made him jump. It was a huge door with a large skull carved at the top. Certainly, he didn't expect to see that. It was the kind of door that practically screamed that something horrible awaited him behind it. Still, he felt a little relieved that it wasn't a trap that would sever his limbs. Dan forced himself to stay calm and wait for Ares. At the same time, Ares was swatting monsters away without even slowing down. He moved at incredible speed. Chloe asked him again what was happening. He told her that what Dan had stepped on was Lick's teleportation magic circle. She asked where it had taken him. If his guess was correct, it would be Lick's chamber. Dan looked around and felt horror creep up his spine as he saw what was there. A figure in dark armor sat on a throne with a horned helmet and layered black armor, a purple cloak over its shoulders, as it calmly rested its hands, exuding the cold aura, and intimidating aura of a ruler of darkness. But it didn't move. Dan felt nervous. He realized it was Lick, but it seemed to be asleep. He felt lucky. He thought that if he didn't wake it up, maybe he could survive this. He really hoped that would happen. But there was a problem. He was already inside the room, and since there was a chance he could trigger another trap by accident, he decided to stay still and wait silently in the darkness. But then his baseball bat started to glow. He had no idea why it had suddenly happened, especially since it had never done that before. The Lick opened its eyes, and Dan immediately took guard. The Lick moved. Purple flames erupted from its eyes as its face, hidden behind a dark helmet. looked forward, radiating a terrifying and overwhelming aura. The situation was dire. He gripped his staff, then raised it as purple cosmic flames erupted behind him, and his dark armor gleamed as a terrifying aura spread in all directions. Dan knew one thing for sure: he was doomed. Meanwhile, Chloe was shocked by what she had just discovered. Ares sensed that a lick had already awakened. Returning to our protagonist, Dan's legs gave out and he fell to the ground. He immediately realized that this enemy was on a completely different level. Alik pointed a finger at him, and power began to concentrate at his fingertip. Dan was alarmed. A huge beam of purple energy shot down and slammed into the ground in a violent explosion. Dan knew there was no way to dodge it. He gritted his teeth and decided to cut it. He swung his bat and hit the powerful energy as if it were a baseball. He put all his strength into that hit, and the attack was sent directly back towards the lick. Of course, the lick didn't expect it. An explosion erupted in the air where the lick was floating. Dan watched intently. The dust slowly settled, and it left the lick completely unharmed. Van cursed inwardly. It hadn't even flinched. He wondered how he was supposed to face a monster like that. Alik moved his fingers again. Suddenly, purple vines sprouted from the ground. They coiled around his arms and legs. He was completely immobilized. Alik glared at him angrily. Then he spoke, saying that he possessed unusual power. He asked if the source of that power was his heart. The lick reached out towards him. He said he would know the answer. Once he opened Dan up, suddenly a sword pierced his arm. Both were surprised and turned towards the source of the attack. It was Ares, and this guy is just accumulating aura now. Dark energy swirled around his sword. He glared at Lick. The vines were cut. Dan finally freed himself. Ares asked him if he had any injuries. Then he told Dan to get up, and that he would handle everything from here. The Lick fired at Ares. The attack came from all directions. Explosions erupted around him. Dan began to worry about Ares. The Lick waited calmly to see the result. Smoke covered the entire area, but through the smoke, Ares swung his sword and split Lick in half. The Lick didn't expect it. Ares emerged from the attack completely unharmed. Lick's body split in two and slowly rejoined. The Lick said they truly shared a terrible fate that bound them. He slowly brought his hands together in front of his chest. Purple energy gathered between his palms as dark power swirled around his armored body. A huge purple energy blast erupted above him, spreading like a giant star in the sky. Dan asked what that was. Alik replied, the end of the star, and threw it at them. It was a massive wave of sinister energy. Dan's eyes widened, and he gasped as he took in that overwhelming power. In front of him, Ares prepared for the impact. The purple energy detonated violently, shattering the ground and sending rocks and debris everywhere. When the chaos subsided, Ares was still standing in front of Dan, protecting him. His sword was planted in the ground, and he gripped it tightly. He looked exhausted, and Lick was still floating above them. The huge blast dispersed and scoured the ground around them. But Ares and Dan remained in the only intact spot, completely unharmed. Evidently, Alik didn't expect that. He said that Ares had always faced him alone, but this time he had brought a strange companion, which made him wonder if Ares had a few tricks up his sleeve to destroy his body. But Ares wasn't the only one who had prepared a gift. Once again, Alik brought his hands together and activated a spell called Whisper of the Void. Ares immediately took guard. Suddenly, everything around them became blurry. Alik was now right beside him. He told him that this was a space created solely for him. Ares asked if Alik intended to fight him in a one-on-one duel. Alik replied that that was fine, but his real plan was to open the gift Ares had brought. Suddenly, Dan was also transported into that space. Alik said he knew Ares had prepared a dagger intended to pierce his heart, but that instead, that blade would turn against him. Ares remained silent. He couldn't even move a single muscle. He suspected it was a form of mental magic rather than reality. He knew breaking free wouldn't be easy. Normally, he would have taken his time to analyze and dismantle the spell. But if he delayed now, Dan's life would be in danger. He could only hope Dan held on a little longer. Meanwhile, Dan was ordered to surrender to the Lord of the Dead and the terror of the living. Crushing pressure forced him to give everything up. Alik wanted his flesh and his power. Suddenly, a gigantic phantom beast appeared, its glowing eyes and enormous fangs towering over the battlefield. It replied to Alik with a clear refusal, saying that the vessel belonged to her. The creature inside Dan's bat was furious that Alik dared to enter its domain fearlessly. Alik had no idea what was happening. Whatever that thing in front of him was, it was undoubtedly far more powerful than him. Moments later, Ares suddenly found himself back in the room. He stood there stunned. Lick's magic disintegrated. To his surprise, Lick cursed him for bringing something like that with him. Ares saw the opportunity. He assumed a fighting stance and struck Lick. Ares had a completely serious expression. The moment Lick was cut, Dan's beast lunged at him and devoured him, until nothing was left. Dan groaned in pain. Ares heard him and became worried. Dan asked what had just happened. His baseball bat began to glow brightly. Suddenly, purple energy lunged at Dan. Ares recognized it immediately. It was the Lick's mana. The energy enveloped Dan, causing him to scream in pain. A dark and sinister power erupted from his body. The amount of mana was overwhelming. Ares worried about what might happen if Dan absorbed something like that. Dan gripped his chest tightly, his forehead resting on the ground. Then he collapsed face down. Ares ran to him, yelling at him to stay conscious. He wondered if it was an adverse reaction from absorbing the Lick. Suddenly someone spoke, Lord Asclepius. Ares froze in surprise. He slowly turned towards the voice, and a woman appeared. Dan heard someone call him by his name. The voice told him to look for Anyer. As soon as he heard that, he woke up. He screamed loudly, and looking around, everything was calm. That only confused him further. He looked for Ares and Cho, but couldn't find them anywhere. He wondered where they had gone. Then he saw a bag and a note nearby. It was a note they had written saying that something urgent had come up, so they had to move on first. They also said they had managed to defeat Lick thanks to him. Unfortunately, Dan had never seen those letters before, so he couldn't read them. But most importantly, he had a bad feeling. He thought maybe they had abandoned him. A while ago, Ares was in a very bad mood. He asked the woman, what brings you here? The woman was Aquinas. She was tall with long crimson hair and walked with quiet elegance. She wore a black dress adorned with a golden butterfly. The hem of her dress spread like butterfly wings. She smiled at him and informed him that his imperial majesty had summoned him. Ares sheathed his sword again. For him, it was unexpected news. She asked him, since when has that been a surprise? After all, his majesty never asked for permission in advance. Ares frowned. She told him they could discuss the details at the palace, as it seemed he had already finished his business there. Anyway, they were about to cross the portal, when suddenly someone called out to Ares. They both turned towards the voice. It was Chloe. She asked if Dan was okay, then quickly asked what had happened to Lick. But when she saw Aquinas, she froze in alarm. Her expression turned furious. Akina simply waved at her as if they were old friends. Then Chloe noticed Dan, who lay on the ground. She hurried over and tried to wake him up. Ares told her to calm down. He explained that Dan had probably fainted from the impact of absorbing Lick. His condition was not life-threatening. Akina simply observed the scene. Ares didn't seem happy at all. He obviously had more questions about it, but he had to leave. He called Chloe and told her to put some food and a map in a small backpack, and to leave it for Dan. Chloe was surprised but understood the mission. Aquinas watched them silently. She began to suspect Dan. After all, she had just learned that he had absorbed Lick. She found it quite amusing. It was very interesting information. She wasn't even able to hide her sinister smile. A few seconds later, she realized and quickly came to her senses. At the same time, everything was ready. Oris told them they could leave. They walked towards the portal. But Oris suddenly stopped next to Aquinas. He leaned towards her and whispered a warning. It would be wise for her to stop taking an interest in that boy. That is, if she wanted to live a long life. Chloe glanced back at Dan before entering the portal. Aquinas did the same. Dan was still lying there, sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around him. She murmured softly that she would keep it in mind. Then the portal closed. At that moment, Dan complained that they were very cruel. He felt very sad. They hadn't been together long, but he already considered them his family. He couldn't believe they had just left him like that. Was he the only one who really cared about them? After venting for a while, he finally accepted that they probably had their reasons. Ares said they had defeated Lick thanks to him, but Dan honestly wondered if he had done anything. And he definitely didn't feel stronger. Even though he had supposedly absorbed it, he scratched his head and thought about it. If that was the case, he thought he should at least take some loot to compensate. They had just defeated a giant boss, so there had to be something good around. He picked up a heroic-grade cursed elf skull orb. There was also a legendary-grade staff of pain and despair. Then he found a unique-grade evil, screeching demonic sword, a legendary-grade blood-stained ritual dagger, and a heroic-grade vengeful spirit warhammer. Dan stared at the pile of weapons and then decided to forget about them. Each and everyone seemed capable of cursing him for life. If nothing else, he soon left the tomb. He took out the map and compass. It was much harder than he expected. After all, he had spent his whole life navigating with phone apps. According to the map, there was a village beyond the forest to the west. It was far away. Dan let out a long sigh. He was alone again. Still, he continued his journey. Along the way, he ran into an undead, and the skeleton stumbled backward after the blow. 3 months had passed since he parted ways with Ares and the others. During that time, he crossed the wasteland alone. Thanks to what Ares and Chloe had taught him, he managed to survive without too much trouble. It was still a very lonely journey, but at last, Dan was leaving that desolate place. He reached an area full of lush grass and tall trees, the first vegetation he had seen in almost a year. Finally, something peaceful and beautiful. No monsters, no endless sandstorms, just calm nature. Then suddenly there was an explosion nearby. Dan simply looked in the direction of the explosion. He didn't seem impressed at all. In that forest, someone was running at incredible speed. It was a blond man who looked like an adventurer. He cursed inwardly. He wondered why this was happening. An attack was about to hit him. The explosion sent him flying. He had no idea why that creature was there. For starters, it was a wyvern. He knew he was finished. Even Robert, the strongest among them, had died without being able to lift a finger. So a bronze-ranked hunter like him stood no chance. They had only come here to exterminate a few goblins, but instead they ran into this terrifying creature. It roared right in his face. He accepted that this was all he could do. Then suddenly, a figure lunged directly into the wyvern's mouth. He opened his eyes and saw her. He recognized her. It was Aliosa. She called him Alt, asked him why he was standing there, and told him to get up immediately. He asked her why she had returned, if he was supposed to be the bait so they could escape. She replied that she wasn't going to let him play the lone hero. Her words moved him. He didn't argue anymore. He supposed she must have some kind of plan. She replied that if she had a plan, Robert wouldn't be dead anymore. She told him that on the count of 3. He should run without looking back. He said he understood. She started counting, but the wyvern attacked before she could finish, and sent her flying. Alt was shocked. He screamed her name, and suddenly an arrow whizzed past him. It hit the wyvern squarely in the face. Alt was horrified because another person he knew, Saris, had appeared there. It was she who shot the arrow. She apologized to him and explained that she hadn't dared to run away alone. He yelled at her to get out of there. Immediately, the wyvern moved. It lunged directly at Saris. She was about to be devoured. At that moment, she wished someone would come. Tears streamed down her eyes, unexpectedly. Someone arrived and smashed the wyvern's head. Karis and Alt were stunned. It was Dan, and our boy had just beaten the wyvern. A few moments later, Alt and Saris thanked him wholeheartedly. The wyvern died with a huge lump on its head. Dan told them it was no big deal, but Alt hurried to say that it was. Dan had just saved their lives. If he hadn't helped them, they would already be dead. Fortunately, Aliosa's life was not in danger either, but defeating a wyvern with a single blow. That made Alt ask Dan something. Was he a high-ranking hunter? Alt even guessed that he might be gold-ranked or maybe even platinum. But our protagonist didn't know what to say. They awaited his answer. Dan simply asked what they were talking about. The two looked confused. Dan had no idea what they were referring to. A few moments later, Alt carried Aliosa as they continued their journey. Dan told them that, in reality, he came from another world. He hoped they would find it hard to believe. Karo Out said that their savior would not lie about something like that. Saris added that she had never heard of anything like it, but that teleportation magic already existed in this world, so traveling between dimensions might also be possible. Meanwhile, she carried the weapons of her fallen comrades. Dan offered to help her, but she said it would be asking too much of him. Alt added that they didn't know everything about the world either, so they were open to strange possibilities. Dan realized that cases like his were probably very rare. Alt admitted that he was truly surprised. Earlier, a strange monster suddenly appeared and devoured the wyvern's corpse, and suddenly turned into a mass. The weapon radiated an incredible amount of mana. Alt asked if everyone in Dan's world had abilities like that. Dan suddenly found himself in a predicament, so he simply replied. It was probably easier than trying to explain everything. Finally, they arrived. Alt told him about the place. It was Easter, most of the territory of the Kingdom of Mania called Chiltrock. A few moments later, we see Dan holding back tears. Alt saw him and asked him what was wrong. He wondered if the city wasn't as impressive as Dan had expected. Dan shook his head and said that wasn't it. It's just that it had been a long time since he had seen so many people. Later that day, Dan ate heartily at a pub. He also drank a lot. He seemed completely satisfied. He would never have imagined that his first legal drink as an adult would be in another world. Not that he had drunk before, but still, the alcohol here tasted different. Alt and Saris told him they had to take care of their companion. First, they had to attend to Aliosa and recover Robert's body. Dan felt uncomfortable learning that they had lost a companion. Alt noticed the change in his expression. He handed Dan some money and told him to rest at a nearby inn. They would meet him later. Dan accepted and thanked him. He assumed they would return once they had fulfilled their obligations. By then, Dan's face was already flushed. Looking around, he could no longer deny it. He had really arrived in another world. There were dwarves wandering around, even beast-like humanoids. Dan began to think about what he should do first, and then decided that it was probably best to sleep for now. The next day, he had swollen eyes when he woke up. He lay in bed and thought for a while. Sleeping in a real bed again made him lose track of time. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Dan opened it and asked who it was. It was Tears. He asked if he had rested well. Behind her was Aliosa. Dan looked at them blankly. It was clear that he hadn't expected them. They all went downstairs. Someone immediately called our protagonist. It was Alt, and he gestured to him with his hand. Dan saw him and approached. Soon the food was served. Alt told him that Aliosa had insisted on seeing him to thank him. She seemed a little shy. Alt also admitted that yesterday he was so out of it that he couldn't thank her as she deserved. Dan told them it was nothing and that, thanks to them, he had rested well the night before. Then Alt formally introduced himself. He was a copper seal hunter from the group of righteous wanderers. Alt was human. Next, Dan introduced Alyosha Walder and the sole rear guard of his group. Saris, she was also human. Dan asked what hunter and seal meant. They seemed surprised by the question. Judging by their reaction, it seemed he had just asked something very basic. Alt quickly realized his mistake. He remembered that Dan didn't know much about this place, so he explained that hunters were people who hunted wild animals, or monsters, or who carried out various related tasks, and that they had to be affiliated with the Hunters Guild. Hunters usually organized themselves into groups. The minimum was 2 people, but the usual was 4. Seal referred to the rank awarded by the guild. In order they were steel, copper, silver, gold, platinum, and mithril. Some groups had members with mixed ranks, but since quests could only be accepted based on the lowest ranked member, most people preferred to team up with others of the same rank. Steel and copper hunters usually hunted wild animals or small monsters. They also handled other minor tasks. Silver seal hunters are veteran hunters who mainly focus on hunting monsters. Most people end their hunter careers without ever reaching the silver rank. Gold seal hunters are high-level hunters and personnel. Even the large branches of the guilds may only have the equivalent of 3 or 4 groups of them starting from the gold rank. It is more common to lead a silver group than to form one composed solely of gold hunters. Alt said he wasn't sure of the exact number of platinum seal hunters, but he knew there were fewer than 20 in the entire guild. In fact, he had never met any in his life. Lastly, the mithril seal had only existed for 10 people throughout the continent's history, and of those, only 3 mithril seal hunters were currently active. They were basically living legends. Now, Dan understood how impressive the ranking system was. The seal rank not only showed strength, but also served as proof of identity, and a kind of credit rating. That's why lost hunter seals were sold at high prices on the black market. Of course, impersonating a hunter was a serious crime. To earn a seal, hunters had to complete many guild missions. Alt's team was a copper seal group. He admitted it wasn't something to brag about, but they managed to get by. Dan felt his head was going to explode with so much information. And since they were talking about it, Alt decided to ask something. He wanted Dan to join his group. Dan was stunned. Alt quickly clarified that he wasn't forcing him. But Dan didn't know much about this world. He probably needed money or some form of identification, and his group happened to be short a member. In other words, their interests aligned quite well. Dan knew that. He had to adapt to this society at least until he figured out how to get back home. For that, he needed money. And knowledge. Aliosa said she had heard that Dan was incredibly strong. Alt. And Saris told him that he had defeated a wyvern with 1 blow, so they probably wouldn't have to worry about dying in the near future. But suddenly someone called them liars. A loud bang echoed across the table. It was a blonde girl, and she accused them of making things up. Dan didn't seem impressed at all. Aliosa told the girl, Mary, to stop bothering him if she was leaving. Mar scoffed at her, and asked why a pet was sitting at the same table as people. She told Aliosa that, since she was losing hair, she should eat on the floor like the beast she was. This woman was the leader of the noble oppressors. Mar de Chatelain, a human. Aliosa was furious. Alt quickly tried to calm her down. Then Mar turned her attention to Dan. It was a face he hadn't seen before. She asked if he was the one who had captured the wyvern. Our boy simply replied yes. She asked if he had brought any trophies, as those could be sold for a good price. Alt simply said there were circumstances. Mary scoffed to her that just proved they were lying. Dan raised his voice. He had been putting up with her nonsense, but now it was time for her to stop. Mary asked him what he would do if she didn't, and that made Dan lose his temper. He cracked his knuckles and said that dwarf was starting to get on his nerves. Mary became furious because he called her a dwarf. She retorted by calling him a lowlife who had crawled out of some unknown hole. Being called a lowlife only angered Dan further. Just then, a man with orange hair intervened and apologized. Dan looked confused. The man simply smiled at him. Mary was annoyed that the man named Brian was interfering. He apologized to her and said they were the ones interrupting the meal. He suggested they return to their table. Brian was a human from the noble oppressors. He pushed Mary towards her table while telling her to just go eat. She screamed at him to let her go. Dan was also getting angry with him. Dan grabbed Brian by the shoulder and asked him what was wrong. Brian's expression turned serious. He looked at Dan with anger and suggested they call it a day. Dan was bewildered. He sighed, then looked back at him and said that those two were already getting on his nerves. Silence filled the room. Dan and Brian stared at each other, and then a tiny person tapped Brian on the leg and asked what was wrong with such a tense atmosphere. She also told Brian to shut up. After all, Mary had started everything. Brian could only sigh. The little girl apologized for the trouble. She explained that she found it hard to believe someone had defeated a wyvern with one blow. That's why Mary had behaved so rudely. Her name was Irene. She was a dwarf. Dan simply stared at her. He couldn't believe that the smallest person there was, somehow, the most mature person there. Of course, he wisely kept that thought to himself. Erin scolded Brian, reminding him that she had sent him to mediate, not to join the fight. Dan looked towards their table. Both Alt and Saris looked worried, so Dan simply said he didn't want trouble. They could take Mary and leave. Erin thanked him for his understanding. Mar peeked out from behind Brian and stuck out her tongue at Dan. Dan's face instantly turned red with anger. He told them to get out before he did something he might regret. When he returned to his seat, Saris admired how well he had handled it. She said Mare had a terrible mouth, but deep down she had a good heart. Dan quickly changed the subject and asked where they should start. He was referring to becoming a hunter. Later that day, Dan received a plaque. Alt told him that all he had to do was pay the registration fee. Dan couldn't believe it was that simple. Alt then asked him if he had any money, as the change he had given him earlier wasn't much. Dan said his travel companion had left him something. He emptied the contents of the bag again. Dan was bewildered when only one coin fell out, but Alt quickly realized it was a gold coin. One gold coin was worth 1,000 crowns. Each coin had a different value. A tin coin was worth 1 crown. Copper coins were worth 10 crowns. Silver coins were equivalent to 100 crowns. And a gold coin was worth 1,000 crowns. Dan asked if that was enough. Alt told him the registration fee was 500 crowns. Dan was stunned to see that it would cost him half of his gold coin. Suddenly, silence fell at their table. Now that Dan had registered, everyone knew it was time to stop bothering him. Dan asked if they were leaving yet. Alt explained that they had a lot to prepare before the raid. Besides, Dan needed time to rest and prepare. He told Dan that they should meet again there in 3 days. Dan was horrified at the thought. Alt understood how he felt. He told him that the inn was run by the Hunters Guild. Most of the guests staying there were hunters, so Dan could use the time to make contacts, and if he got bored, he could try to complete 1 or 2 quests. If Dan was still alone within 3 days, they would welcome him, even if he didn't join their group permanently. They could go on the raid together. Dan said he would think about it. They said goodbye. Dan wished them a safe journey home. Once they left, Dan let out a long sigh. His morning had been incredibly busy. He held a single gold coin in his hand. It was worth 1,000 crowns. That morning's breakfast had cost 3 crowns per person, plus drinks of meat, and the previous night's room. The total had been 25 crowns. He quickly realized that that meant he could afford about 20 days of lodging and food at his place. That amount of money wouldn't even cover a few meals combined. Suddenly, Dan missed home. He had been so close to living a comfortable life, and now he was back to struggling just to survive. With another sigh, he decided he should start preparing for a hunting mission. A few moments later, he bought some equipment. The shopkeeper looked him up and down and said he was a real tourist. She charged him 230 crowns for the equipment. Dan knew she was probably ripping him off. He left, still feeling a bit ripped off. He was glad he hadn't even tried to buy plate armor. After that, he had no idea what to do next. And since he was running out of money, he decided to accept a quest. He approached the guild receptionist, placed a paper on the counter, and said he wanted to sign up for a quest. She recognized him as the new guy from that morning. She politely told him that the quest he had chosen was for silver-ranked hunters, and then pointed him to the section where the iron-ranked quests began. So his grand epic adventure began by hauling sacks of flour, cleaning stables, as well as doing a mountain of laundry. At that point, he couldn't even call himself a hunter. He felt more like a very poorly paid handyman. Soon the sun began to set. Dan returned to the inn looking like a zombie. He had spent the entire day doing exhausting work. It was certainly not what he had imagined when he enlisted to become a hunter. He worked all day for a meager 30 crowns, living day by day as always. Dan muttered to himself that life was a struggle, no matter what world you lived in. As he walked down the street, he passed a street vendor. The man was selling grilled skewers. Dan's mouth watered instantly. He told himself that buying one wouldn't hurt. After all, he had worked hard that day. So he bought a mysterious meat skewer for 3 crowns. As soon as he took a bite, his eyes widened. It was incredible. Even someone who had grown up on instant ramen in his country would love this. Dan wondered what the secret was. He was chatting with the vendor about the food when suddenly, someone spotted him. This person took out a compass, and the needle pointed directly at Dan. She watched him silently. At that moment, Dan was still asking the vendor why the food tasted so good. Suddenly, someone tugged at his shirt sleeve. She said she had finally found him. Dan turned and saw a petite woman with elf ears and red hair. She wore a witch's hat. She smiled at him gleefully and called him her destiny. A few moments later, we see Dan listening to the woman. She told him that he was her destined hero. He asked for proof. She said she came from her master's prophecy. According to the prophecy, the one the compass points to is the hero who will save the world, and she is destined to help him. Naturally, Dan found it hard to believe something like that, but she had no doubts. Her master was Denise, the prophet witch. Dan asked if she was famous, and the woman proudly replied that her master's prophecies had never been wrong. When her master's shoulder hurt, she predicted rain, and sure enough, it rained that same day. Dan said that sounded like a weather forecast. That instantly angered her. She accused him of blasphemy and demanded that he retract immediately. Dan quickly apologized and retracted. There was no need to start a religious war over the weather. Then he asked what would happen now, if he really was the destined hero. She explained that her master had told her to help the destined hero. Whatever he does, her magic will undoubtedly help him. Dan asked her what she thought he was going to do. She replied with complete confidence that he would save the world. Dan immediately interrupted her and told her she was wrong, because his only goal is to return to his own world. That answer left her bewildered. Dan told her he had no idea who her master was or what all this hero nonsense was about, and that he had not the slightest intention of saving the world. He had a million reasons to go home as soon as possible, so he told her to find someone else if she had no idea what she was looking for. Because he was sure it wasn't him, then he left. His words saddened her. Mary saw it all. She smiled from ear to ear as she commented that the woman seemed to have been abandoned. Brian told her to stop meddling in other people's love lives. He suggested that if she had nothing better to do, she should just come help him. She replied that he didn't understand. Other people's lives are the highest form of entertainment. He replied that while she enjoyed her entertainment, he was stuck doing the annoying paperwork that the party leader was supposed to handle. She shouted that taking care of those things for her was the only reason for his existence. She argued that nobles have many other noble obligations. Brian realized that the woman was Denise's disciple, the prophet witch. It was interesting information. At that time, Denise had given her disciple a compass. It was a magical artifact that would guide her to her destiny. He told his disciple Ariel to leave, and just like that, Ariel set off towards her destiny. However, what awaited her next was something she had never imagined. At that moment, Dan was carrying some sacks. He was sweating profusely. The old woman thanked him for his work. Dan greeted her cheerfully. He approached and chatted with her. Ariel watched him from afar. She didn't understand why he spent all day doing insignificant tasks. The old woman told him he had done a great job, so she gave him a little more pay. Dan thanked her. Ariel wondered if he was completely penniless. She wondered if he was really the person her master had told her about. She wondered what she should do now. She came out of her thoughts when Dan spoke to her. He couldn't believe she was still there. He already knew she had been following him all day. He told her to leave him be and go back to her master, or wherever she had come from. He insisted that he was not the destined hero, or anything she believed. She replied that her master had passed away. Dan apologized immediately. She recalled that he wanted to return to his original world. So she decided to help him, whether it was finding a way home or simply cleaning a barn. In any case, she was determined to help him. The next day at the guild, Alt was putting on his armor. He was sitting in a corner. Someone called him. It was Sarah. She said she couldn't find Dan anywhere, and he didn't seem to be in his room either. Alt found it strange. Then someone pointed out that it was obvious. Dan had run away. It was Mary. She said that after boasting so loudly about killing a wyvern with one blow, he had probably gotten scared that the truth would be discovered. Alt noticed that she was wearing full armor. He asked her what she was doing there. She didn't seem to have heard. She told him that there had been reports of monsters appearing near Siltruck that do not belong in that area. So naturally, her group, the noble oppressors, kindly offered to search the surrounding territory. And one of their tasks was to supervise a group of rookie hunters who had just lost half their combat strength. Alt said he could tolerate her looking down on him and Saris, but warned her to stop insulting Jan. A woman with glasses and sheep horns from Mars' group asked who Dan was. Brian couldn't answer her directly. The woman was Veronica, a white wall beast from their group. Saris shouted that Dan had saved their lives, and that if Mar continued to disrespect him, she wouldn't allow it. Mary scoffed and said that her savior was busy with his love life. Saris asked her what she meant. Mar said that there was an elf girl talking about destiny and things like that. She added that they were probably getting too intimate to remember their promise. Saris approached with a dark aura forming around her, and said that it was a lie. Mary froze. Saris said that Dan had told them he came from another world, and that he didn't know anyone else but them. Yet somehow after only 3 days, he suddenly had a lover. That was complete nonsense. She made it clear that she was running out of patience. Then someone spoke up and asked who had exactly run away. Everyone turned towards the voice. Ryan looked calm, but Alt looked surprised. It was Dan. Wariel was right behind him. Dan cheerfully greeted everyone, but what he said next would surprise them even more. Alt was glad to see him. Dan smiled back at him. He said he hoped he wasn't late. Mary immediately accused him of being a traitor. Ariel and Dan were speechless. Mary scolded Dan for ditching the people he was supposed to go partying with, only to join someone else. And while this was happening, noticed the dark aura surrounding Ceres. I think this girl is jealous. Anyway, Mary called him a shameless traitor. Dan was getting angry with her and asked why she was getting involved. Alt said it wasn't mandatory, so he didn't care, but it was still completely unexpected. He referred to the elf mage. He asked how they had met. Saris was still emitting a very dangerous aura. Dan said it was a long story. Ariel calmly said that she had been the one to find him. That destiny had led her to his side. Dan couldn't believe she had said that out loud. Alt and Mary blushed at the same time. Meanwhile, Saris seemed on the verge of committing murder at any moment. Brian was sitting at another table, listening silently, but even he started to blush, thinking that suddenly the venue was offering top-notch romantic drama. Dan quickly yelled at Ariel not to say it like that because people would get the wrong idea. Alt asked her name. She told him. Then he asked if she would join the expedition. She said yes, but made it clear that she was interested in nothing more than helping Dan. She had even obtained her hunter license yesterday precisely for that reason. Ryan thought she seemed like the devoted wife type. Veronica commented that she seemed too pure. Alt told them that Aliosin couldn't come because her injuries had not yet fully healed. So having more people was reassuring. Dan apologized for not consulting him earlier. Alt said it was okay, and since everyone was already there, he suggested they get started. Everyone agreed. Goblins are small monsters that possess the intelligence of a small child. They are hostile by nature and can use rudimentary tools. They mainly raid human settlements to steal livestock and property. And although a single goblin poses no great threat, their habit of traveling in packs makes them a serious nuisance. Alt explained that lately there had been frequent reports of goblin raids on small villages on the outskirts of Chiltra. The last time they went looking for a goblin colony, they ended up being attacked by a wyvern. And that's when they met Dan. Now Dan finally understood what had happened. He understood the situation, but still didn't understand why Mars' group was following them. Alt explained that, between the wyvern incident and everything else, there had been a strange surge of monsters near Chiltrock, so he believed they were there to investigate the anomaly and provide protection. Mary told Dan that he should feel honored, because they had personally honored him with their presence just to protect a nobody with a steel insignia like him. Dan was clearly annoyed. He asked if there was really no one else they could send besides those people. Alt understood that Dan might still be annoyed, given how they had met. But despite appearances, the noble oppressors were actually a very promising group. Although they were a new group, only in their second year, they had already been promoted to silver insignia rank in just one. They had performed brilliantly and were currently candidates for the fastest promotion to gold insignia. Dan remained skeptical of them. Mary turned to Ariel and asked where she was from. Brian quickly tried to stop her, but Ariel seemed completely uninterested in the question. Alt admitted that they were certainly unique individuals. Dan muttered that one of these days, he was going to punch that arrogant brat on the head. Before continuing, Alt remembered something he needed to confirm. Since Dan used a blunt weapon, he would go on the front line. Summaries and Ariel would stay in the rear. Next, he asked Ariel what kind of magic she specialized in. She seemed confused by the question and asked what he meant. Alt wondered if his question had been difficult to understand. He admitted that he wasn't a magic expert, but he had heard that there were several main classifications: destruction, augmentation, alchemy, summoning, and necromancy. For example, Veronica was an expert in augmentation magic. Most mages have one main type of magic, so he thought knowing about aerial magic would help with their strategy. She shyly admitted that it was the first time she had been part of a group with a mage. Mages are so rare that most people hardly see one until they reach silver insignia rank. Now she knew what he meant. She was about to answer when suddenly an arrow whizzed past her face. It didn't hit her because Dan caught it in time. Everyone was on alert. They had been shot by goblins, and none of them had seen them coming. Dan glared in the direction of the shot. Brian immediately went into combat mode, as this was a goblin ambush. But Mare stopped him, telling him there was no need for them to intervene. She wanted to leave it to Alt's group, since they were real hunters. After all, the goblin shrieked loudly, but before it could even move, it had already been hit by Dan's baseball bat. Then Dan noticed the other goblins. Some were already dead, stabbed, and others had arrows sticking out of their bodies. He looked at the members of his group and commented that it had been easier than he thought. Alt told him his skills were impressive. As always, Sarah said it was strange that goblins would ambush armed hunters. Alt agreed, as goblins usually attack the weak, so they would normally go after children first, or the elderly, and while he wasn't sure if it was intentional, they aimed for Ariel, their mage, first. In any case, they still had to find and eliminate the goblin colony, because there was a high chance that not all of them were there. Suddenly, Dan realized something. He should have left one alive. He asked if they should venture further inside now. Zaraz and Alt were dumbfounded. Even Ariel seemed alarmed. Meanwhile, Dan kept asking what that colony was like. Mary was also surprised. Dan kept rambling. Seeing that no one dared to say anything, he was bewildered. He asked if something was wrong. He had no idea that a giant red monster was looming right behind him. Alt yelled at him to look behind him. Dan slowly turned around. The monster's claws were already lunging towards him. Mary lunged with her spear and knocked his arm away with a blow. She was already in full combat mode. Dan and Alt were surprised to see her intervene. They didn't expect Mary to be the first to act. Brian told Dan to stay back. Alt would handle it. From then on, Dan was speechless. Brian looked completely serious. They didn't expect a Rock Mountain troll to appear so close to the thief. He told Mary that something strange was definitely going on. Mary warned everyone not to let their guard down, because this monster was not an easy opponent. Dan said he would join the fight too, but Alt immediately told him no, because he would only get in the way. Alt admitted that Dan was strong. However, the noble oppressors were also an experienced group. If Dan interfered now, there was a high chance he would disrupt their coordination. So Alt suggested they trust them for the moment. Dan didn't think. Ariel simply sighed. Brian signaled to Veronica. She began to recite a chant and activated her battle spirit fortification. The spell empowered the members of her group. Alt was surprised that she applied fortification magic to 3 people at the same time. The Rock Mountain troll focused on them, lunging forward directly towards Mary. She raised her shield and managed to block its claws, but the impact was strong. The monster pushed her back. At the same time, Erin aimed her crossbow at the monster. She fired an arrow just as Brian charged forward and hit the Rock Mountain troll in the eye. It staggered backward. Brian called out to his beloved. She already knew what to do. She placed her shield so he could step on it and launch himself into the air. Then she entrusted the monster to him. Brian gripped his sword tightly and slashed its other eye. Blood gushed out like a fountain, causing the mountain troll to scream in pain. Dan was stunned by how incredible they were. Each member moved as if they were part of the same body. They looked like a true team that had trained together hundreds of times. Brian landed next to Mary. He had blocked the troll's vision, but the wound was superficial. With the troll's regenerative power, it would heal in an instant. This was the worst possible confrontation for them, as they had no real magical attack. Mary suggested they aim for the heart, the source of its regeneration. She told Veronica to prepare. The noble Uprasser group was known for being a highly refined team due to their fluid coordination and stable positioning, but they also had a fatal weakness, their destructive power. Aaron's crossbow took time to reload, making it difficult to inflict serious damage on giant monsters. Brian, fighting on the front lines with Murray, used 2 short daggers, unsuitable for fighting large monsters. Veronica, the only mage in the group, could only use fortification magic, so her offensive capability was almost non-existent. Mary, who was on the front line, used a unique weapon called a spear, and since a spear is normally designed for mounted combat, her center of gravity tilted backward, making it difficult for a foot soldier without mobility to deploy her full power. However, the noble oppressors group compensated for this in a rather unusual way. They focused their fortification magic entirely on one person, and in this case, that person was Mary. Veronica, spear strength, fortification, speed fortification, durability fortification, and weapon fortification on her. Mary, a heavy infantry fighter, suddenly gained explosive strength and speed thanks to the accumulated fortification spells, and finally reached a speed that even cavalry could not match. When Sarah saw it, she was dumbfounded. Meanwhile, Ariel watched intently. Thanks to this, Mary earned a nickname within the Hunters Guild. She was called the Golden Unicorn. The mountain troll barely reacted before realizing how fast she was moving. The next instant, it pierced the left side of its body with one blow. She emerged from the other side with a smile. Alt and Dan stood there with their mouths open. They could literally see her through the huge hole in the troll's body. Mare proudly declared that a troll was nothing against her. She even started boasting about her group, but never finished the sentence. Suddenly, she vomited blood. Alt and Saris froze in surprise. Brian ran directly towards her. He immediately scolded her, because that method put extreme strain on her body. Mary simply said that a noble should always set an example, and that such sacrifice meant nothing to her. She then told them that for now, they should return and ask for reinforcements. Unfortunately for them, the situation was far from over. Suddenly, an arrow pierced his chest. Brian's eyes widened in utter shock. Even Mar looked confused. Her legs weakened. Her face quickly paled. From the dark forest before them, several monsters slowly emerged. They came out in a line, one after another. Goblins and trolls. Brian looked ahead and asked, what the hell was that? There were too many. Alt felt a chill run down his spine. He asked where all these monsters had come from. Mary called Veronica. Veronica jumped in surprise. Mary told her to take Aaron and the others and get out of there. She would buy them some time. Aaron immediately worried about her. Brian was about to speak. Mary already knew what he meant, but she begged him not to say it. She reminded him of the notion of noble obligation and said that now it was her turn to fulfill her duty as a noble. Brian's expression twisted in pain, but the tense moment was suddenly broken when someone intervened and told her not to be so dramatic. The voice said there was a limit to how much she could look down on a boy. It was Dan. He asked her if she really thought he would just run away and leave her behind. Everyone looked at him stunned. Not even Saris and Ariel expected it. Mary frowned and told him to stop being stubborn and leave, especially after seeing the fight earlier. Besides, she said he wouldn't even be able to scratch a troll with that rudimentary weapon. And even if he happened to be lucky and kill one, there was no way he could deal with all of them. Dan simply shrugged and said that compared to what he had fought with Ares, those seemed like a piece of cake. Unfortunately for him, that only enraged Mary further. She yelled at him to stop talking nonsense and get moving because they didn't have time for that. At that moment, a troll raised its fist and lunged at her. Mary saw it coming and knew she was lost, but Dan intervened. With a single blow from his bat, he tore the monster's arm off. Mary and Brian were completely dumbfounded. The troll clutched its bleeding shoulder and roared in pain. Then Dan casually called the veteran hunter. He asked him what the plan was. He also pointed out that everyone else was waiting. Mary just stared at him, completely stunned. Alt quickly added that they were going to fight too. Aaron stepped forward and asked what kind of teammates would abandon their own leader. Mary froze for a moment. She said nothing, then she took a deep breath and her expression turned serious. She ordered Brian and Ceres to focus on the goblins first. There were too many trolls, so they had to face them one by one. They would distract the trolls while Dan dealt with them. But suddenly someone said, "Wait." It was Ariel. She calmly said she would handle it. Dan blinked in surprise. He asked her if she really had a plan. Ariel simply smiled. Then she reminded him of the question he had asked her earlier, about her main magic, and revealed that she had none, especially since there was no type of magic she couldn't use. She activated mana augmentation, then combined it with concentration augmentation, and combined it with elemental augmentation. Rising into the air, fire began to gather at the tip of her staff, and as she activated the ascending dragon flame, and a huge tornado of fire erupted in the air. It swallowed the monsters whole. The flames ravaged the battlefield, burning a massive section of the forest. Ariel's expression remained calm and serious. Everyone could only watch as the forest turned into an inferno. After a moment, she slowly descended back to the ground. Dan stared at her, completely awestruck. Ariel turned towards them. She smiled gently and said that the problem was solved. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Only the crackling of the burning monsters filled the air. Mar let out a giggle. She said that all of that was completely absurd. And then she collapsed. Brian rushed towards her in a panic. Her condition was worse than ever. The doctor informed them that Mar had been afflicted by a lethal poison. It seemed to be an uncommon toxin, something not normally found anywhere near this region. The doctor explained that he had already done all he could, but unless they found an antidote soon, he couldn't guarantee Mar's survival. Bran quietly said that he understood. Meanwhile, Dan wondered if Mar would be all right. Ariel remained silent. Dan looked around and thought it was strange. Given that Mary used to be a noble, he expected her to be treated in some grand mansion, so he couldn't understand why she had been brought to such a dilapidated place. Instead, Aaron then revealed that Mary was no longer a noble. Dan blinked in surprise. He asked her what she meant by that. After all, Brian followed her everywhere and kept calling her my lady. Aaron explained that Mary did indeed come from a noble family, and it was also true that Brian had once been her servant, but that was all in the past. A long time ago, when Brian was still young, he was a prisoner being transported. The carriage transporting him was large and surrounded by soldiers. Those soldiers wore a red flag with a black emblem. Several other prisoners were sitting inside the carriage with him. One of them was a middle-aged man. The man asked the boy what crime he had committed to end up there. Brian remained silent. The old man shrugged and said that he could keep it to himself if he wanted. After all, everyone captured during the war usually ended up on the gallows anyway, so the charge didn't really matter. Meanwhile, the guards riding horses behind the carriage complained amongst themselves. One of them said it would be easier to execute the criminals on the spot like this. He didn't understand why they had to go through the trouble of transporting them. His companion replied that it was for appearances. At the very least, they had to pretend that there was some kind of process. But the truth was obvious. Most of the people in that carriage were probably not even serious offenders. There simply wasn't time for trials during the war, so they were rounding up people and dispatching them all at once. Hearing that only made the situation even worse. Then a guard warned the other to be careful. Speaking so bluntly could get him into trouble. Unfortunately for them, they never finished that conversation. Suddenly, an arrow pierced the guard's neck. He choked as blood gushed out. The soldiers immediately shouted that they were under attack. Brian saw it all clearly as he was sitting near the carriage door. A blue flag with a yellow rose fluttered in the wind. Moments later, several knights in blue cloaks charged forward. They wore full armor and rode powerful horses. The knights in red uniforms didn't stand a chance. The attackers quickly took them down. Once the fight was over, the knights presented themselves to their lord. They pointed towards the carriage and asked what they should do with the 3 prisoners. The young knight riding at the front spoke first. He told his father that criminals like them should simply be executed on the spot. The middle-aged prisoner trembled in fear. Then one of the knights slowly approached the carriage. Brian turned to look at them. The lord asked them what their crimes were. The middle-aged man hurriedly explained that they were only thieves. At worst, they had only been looting corpses on the battlefield. The lord stabbed the man without warning. He then looked angrily at the other prisoner. The man froze in surprise, and a moment later he killed him too. Brian simply kept his head down. The lord observed him and said that, for someone so young, he seemed lifeless, like a candle that had already burned out. He asked Brian if he truly had no attachment to life left. Then he asked him what his crime was. Brian slowly looked up and glared at him, and told him to just kill him already, if that was what he intended to do. He even mocked him, asking if he was afraid to kill a brat for no reason. The knight beside the lord reacted immediately, but the lord just chuckled. Because that kid had guts. He liked him, in fact. He said the boy would be a perfect gift for his youngest daughter. He ordered his men to put the boy in the carriage. The knight called out to his father, surprised. Just like that, Brian was about to become a slave. That only confirmed what he already believed, that his life was nothing but trash. But strangely, when they brought him back, they allowed him to take a hot bath. And Brian couldn't understand why he was being treated like this. Earlier, as soon as he arrived, the maid immediately complained that he stank. She refused to let him see the young lady in that state, and told him to wash until his skin was practically raw. So now, Brian couldn't believe that a slave like him was sitting in a bathtub. He thought it was ridiculous treatment. He even wondered if this household simply had money to burn. Then another thought crossed his mind. These people were fearless, trusting a criminal like him near their lady. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what she looked like. The knight beside him warned him not to even think of disrespecting the lady, and added that if Brian attempted any mischief, death would be the least of his worries. Brian found the knight to be extremely noisy. Then suddenly, someone announced that the lady was approaching. She came down the stairs with calm and elegant steps. Then she asked him if he was the one her father had sent as a gift. Brian looked her up and down because she was petite. The young Mary nudged him and told him that her father had said he picked him up from the street, and that he looked scruffy and completely rough. Brian was already starting to get annoyed, but then she smiled gleefully and said that, since he was her father's gift, she would treasure him. Brian remained completely indifferent. She asked him what his name was. He replied that his name was Jaren. She commented that it sounded like a very rough name. Brian quickly realized that she had a real talent for getting on people's nerves. He couldn't believe they expected him to spend the rest of his life serving that brat. In his mind, he rejected the idea immediately. Then suddenly she said Brian. Brian blinked, confused. She then clarified that that would be his name from now on. She held out her small hand and said she was looking forward to working with him. Brian frowned. In his mind, the name Brian sounded incredibly cheesy. Someone once said that humans are creatures of adaptation. Instead of robbing streets or committing holdups, Brian now spends his days doing chores he had never attempted before. Instead of stuffing himself with stolen food or near-rotten scraps just to survive, he now eats hot meals prepared just for him. Instead of people holding grudges against him or coming to kill him, people now approach him full of kindness and goodwill. It's only been a few months since he started living like this, but he already feels comfortable and natural, almost as if he had lived like this from the beginning. Linda the maid asked if he could stand it. He replied that it was fine. She watched him for a moment and placed a hand on his forehead, just as she thought. He really looked better with his forehead exposed, which made him blush. He quickly pulled away and asked what was wrong. Suddenly, however, there was something that bothered him in his life. Suddenly, someone called him loudly, so he went to Mare's room. Mare immediately told him that she wanted to eat something sweet. Her biggest problem was the young lady who called him whenever she pleased, without warning. He told her to ask the maids, but she replied that her mother had told her not to eat sweets, and that the maids wouldn't listen to her. He stared at her, and she puffed out her cheeks and started to pout. He could only sigh, so he brought her some macarons, and that instantly made her happy. She ate them eagerly, then proudly declared that this was exactly what she expected from Brian. He had managed to sneak sweets past strict security, and she asked him if he used to be an incredible thief. Brian was no longer the vagabond named Gerard. Now he was Brian, an assistant in the Chatelain household. A few years passed, and Mare still called him. He glanced at her, and Mare happily told him that her father had returned from the campaign. It was the news Brian had been waiting for. The head of the Chatelain household, Wesley Chatelain, a human, had returned. His wife, Catherine Chatelain, also human, welcomed him home. She said it felt good to be home after so long. Mary called out to her father, ran to him and hugged him. He was glad to see his daughter. He realized she had grown so much that he almost didn't recognize her. Then he looked at Brian, who bowed to him. Some men arrived and asked Mar if she was only happy to see her father. She turned to them with a wide smile, saying she was also happy to see her brothers. The eldest son of the Chatelain house, Leon Chatelain, a human, said she had become quite the lady. Now the second son of the Chatelain house, Reinald de Chatelain, a human, teased her, saying she was only as tall as a chestnut. He patted her head and asked if she was doing well. She complained that he was messing up her hair. Leon patted Brian on the shoulder. He thanked him for taking care of his sister as well. Brian was touched by the gesture of the young elder lord. It had been a long time since they had all been together, so the head of the household suggested they share a meal. In the dining room, everyone gathered and the food was served. Risley ate his steak. Mar seemed very happy as she chatted with them. Her siblings also enjoyed the moment. It was a peaceful scene. Seeing them made even Brian smile. After the meal, the table was cleared, and then Risley approached Brian. He said he wanted to talk for a moment. Brian didn't expect it. Under the moonlight, they had a few drinks. It had been 5 years since Brian moved there. Risley asked if life had been bearable for him. Brian thought carefully before answering. Then he said it had been more than he could have ever asked for. That answer made Risley smile. He told Brian that he seemed very different from the man he had seen 5 years ago. A man who was alive but wished he were dead. Brian said it was all thanks to him. He had given a dying man another chance to live, and a reason to keep living. Then Risley asked him about the life he owed him, and if he was willing to use that life for his sake. Brian didn't expect that question at all. As they talked, several men on horseback approached the mansion. Those knights carried lit torches. Their commander raised his hand and gave the signal. That night, their target was the mansion. That night, Ryan hurried to Mare's room. She woke up and asked him what had brought him there. At this hour, he yelled at her to flee immediately. She had no idea what on earth he was talking about. Meanwhile, outside, Risley was smiling, but it was clear he was furious. He was staring intently at a man named Jeffrey, the commander of the night guard surrounding his house. Jeffrey Lutz, a human and the head of the Central Kingdom's Association of Nobles, said that was the only way they could survive. Leon was beside his father. Risley and Leon, along with their guards, stood in front of their mansion's gate. And what Jeffrey said only further enraged Risley, because Jeffrey planned to survive by betraying his own feudal lord and becoming the lapdog of the empire. Jeffrey was taken aback by that statement. He simply replied that he respected the fact that Risley had remained loyal to the end. But not everyone could choose an honorable death like him. Meanwhile, Brian was dragging Che. They ran as fast as they could. She asked him where they were going. He replied that there was no time to explain. They just had to get out of there immediately. Earlier, while having a drink with Risley revealed that a massacre would soon occur in that place, and he had entrusted Murray to Brian. Brian asked what would happen to his lord. Risley simply told him to fulfill his responsibility, and he would fulfill his. At that moment, Risley scoffed at Jeffrey. He said Jeffrey shouldn't try to capture him with just a handful of soldiers. Jeffrey calmly replied that he would never come empty-handed to face the man known as the strongest in the Central Kingdom. Risley's eyes widened. He saw the zodiacs. The creature had a huge, bulky silhouette. Risley became enraged. He yelled that Jeffrey had brought the enemy commander to the royal capital. A few minutes later, the mansion was burning. The maids had been stabbed. Mary saw it all. The corpses lay scattered across the garden. She stopped and stared. Stunned, Brian yelled at her, telling her they had to leave now. He grabbed her by the shoulder and shouted that they didn't have time for this, so she had to pull herself together. Mare's voice trembled as she asked what on earth was happening. Brian grabbed her wrist and dragged her along. Then he opened the door and asked Linda if the horses were ready. But to his surprise, there was a man with a sword in his hand, while Linda's body lay nearby. Covered in blood, the man simply looked at them. At that moment, Linda had already lost her life. Brian's eyes widened. The man told them they had arrived at the perfect time, and that they shouldn't be afraid, because it would all be over before they even felt the pain. But suddenly, someone almost hit that man. The assailant landed right in front of them. Clearly, the enemy hadn't expected this person. It was Reynolds. His expression was deadly serious. He pointed his sword at the culprit and ordered Brian to grab Mary and leave. Brian hesitated. He was worried about the second young lord. Reynolds yelled at him to leave immediately. Brian's face contorted in pain. Still, he dragged Mary away as she screamed, calling for her brother. Brian forced himself to keep moving. Mary sobbed inconsolably as he dragged her away. She kept looking back, towards her brother. Meanwhile, the enemy sighed in annoyance. He said he had only been ordered to capture a few fleeing Mafra, but he hadn't expected to be so lucky. He recognized Rinnel, the second son of the Chatelain family, the most important knight house in the Central Kingdom. He never thought he would have the chance to face him. Rinnel replied that he had already heard the rumors about a man named Hugo Fagatti. At the same time, a horse galloped through the night. Brian and Mary rode it as they fled into the forest. Far from the mansion, Mary sobbed inconsolably. Brian was clearly trying to hold back his own emotions. They had escaped. At that moment, the fireplace was burning as Brian sat there, lost in thought. He sat beside Mary. Then someone announced that the guild's investigation results were already in. It was Alt. He reported that traces of magic had been found on the monsters' corpses, which meant it was most likely the work of beast tamers. Brian, who was on the second floor, chimed in to confirm. Everyone turned to look at him. They hadn't expected him to come out. Aaron asked what the doctor had said, and if Mar was all right. Brian looked at them silently. Then he called out to Dan and Ariel. He asked them to lend him their strength. Elsewhere, a woman said something seemed strange. She had already provided the funds, manpower, monsters, poison, and even the perfect timing. In her eyes, she had given them everything. This was Aquinas of Collies, a human. She asked the man in front of her why he kept failing. The man apologized and explained that a mage had suddenly interfered. He begged her to give him another chance. He was the only one left alive. The other culprits had already been taken down. Their bodies lay scattered. Aquinas decided she had given him more than enough chances. Another man searched one of the bodies and took something from its pocket. It was a vial filled with blue liquid. That man was Hugo Fagatti, a human and a lieutenant of Ares. He asked Aquinas if she was really going to give up on Chiltra. Without further ado, she replied that there was no choice. The surprise attack had failed, so security in the territory would now be much stricter, and the Hunters Guild would most likely intensify its investigation. She was worried that the guild might find out if they tried anything too direct. And above all, she didn't want to incur Asclepius's displeasure. After all, this had all started as something she had proposed half-jokingly. She told Hugo that she was returning. Hugo simply looked at her. He said he would stay because he still had unfinished business. He watched her leave. Then he muttered that there was something he hadn't managed to resolve a long time ago. He was referring to Mary. Meanwhile, a man was being beaten. His hands were tied and he fell face down on the ground. The attacker said he wasn't in the mood to be patient right now. That attacker was Brian. He warned the man that it would be better for him to start telling the truth. Dan was with him. He was keeping an eye on the other men they had tied up. He seemed restless. Meanwhile, Ariel simply sat to the side. She seemed to be sleeping. The man they had just beaten shouted that he knew nothing. He said they had never seen any beast tamers or trolls. Brian didn't believe him. It was impossible for a man who knew the slightest detail of what entered and exited this area wouldn't have noticed a group of monsters and mages of that size. After all, getting information out of guys like this was his specialty. But the man insisted that he had no reason to lie. Brian got so angry that he raised his sword and was about to stab him. The man closed his eyes and prepared for the worst. But suddenly, someone grabbed Brian by the wrist. Brian glared angrily at the person who had stopped him. It was Dan. Dan told him it was enough. He reminded Brian that he had only come to help find Mary's antidote. He had not the slightest intention of collaborating in a murder or torture. Brian pulled his arm away. He said Dan wouldn't have to get his hands dirty. Dan argued that standing by and watching was no different from murdering. Brian remained silent. He gradually calmed down, and then told the man he had been interrogating to get out. Those men fled quickly, even though their hands were still tied. Brian turned to Dan and asked if he was satisfied. He now blamed Dan for reducing their chances of finding the involved beast tamers. Dan couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Brian insisted that those men had the antidote. He yelled at Dan that while he was busy acting like a pathetic hypocrite, the young lady was dying. Ariel remained in the same spot while they argued. She used her magic and concentrated on something, until suddenly she sensed it. She calmly announced that she had found them. Someone nearby had just used magic, so they hurried through the forest. But Ariel was already pale and breathing heavily. Dan realized and immediately understood that she really had no stamina. She had reached her limit, so she told them to go on. Dan asked if she was that bad. Brian decided to go on without them. Dan couldn't believe he was really leaving. Brian replied that he didn't have a second to lose. Dan was speechless. He offered to carry Ariel on his back, but when he turned around, she was gone. Dan's eyes widened and his face froze in disbelief, as if he had just witnessed the most ridiculous thing imaginable. Meanwhile, Hugo was cleaning his sword. He recalled what had happened 5 years ago. Clearly, he never expected the brat from the Chatelain family, whom he had failed to kill back then, to be hiding in a place like this. That thought made him smile. He felt incredibly lucky. Ariel was wandering around. She sighed, realizing she was lost. Her terrible sense of direction had failed her again. She knew she had to reunite with Dan. Suddenly, she heard a rustling in the bushes, and intrigued, she went closer to see what it was. Meanwhile, the clouds turned gray. Brian pushed through the bushes. Then he froze. The man in front of him was someone he knew very well. It was Hugo. This time, Hugo had a long scratch over his right eye, and the pupil on that side looked strangely pale. Hugo tilted his head and asked Brian if he knew him. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to come looking for him. At that moment, Brian's hands were already trembling with rage. Hugo slowly stood up and said it didn't matter. Brian looked around. There were corpses scattered everywhere. The place was a total bloodbath. He asked Hugo if he was the one who had done all this, if he was the one who had made the beast tamers set an ambush for them and massacre everyone who was there. Hugo looked at him angrily and asked if that really mattered. When Brian already seemed to be eager to kill him, Brian didn't expect that answer. But Hugo didn't care, because honestly, he himself was already in the mood to kill someone. Meanwhile, Dan was frantically searching for Ariel. He kept calling her name. He couldn't believe where she had disappeared to in the blink of an eye. Apparently, she had a surprisingly clumsy side. He was already worried enough that Brian had left on his own, especially if he ended up fighting those beast tamers alone. Dan could only frown. This whole mess was becoming a huge headache. At that moment, Brian lunged directly at Hugo. Hugo naturally dodged to avoid the dagger. Brian swung his other arm to hit him, but Hugo ducked to avoid the attack and slashed Brian. Blood gushed from the wound. Then Hugo suddenly remembered him, the servant who had been with the chattel and brat. His memory was quite sharp. He mentioned that she had been poisoned and knew that Brian had come for the antidote. Hugo took it out and showed it to him just to mock him. Hugo said it was the perfect opportunity for Brian to save his beloved's life and get revenge. At the same time, he asked Brian why he was already getting so emotional, but advised him not to rush. Hugo also didn't want the brat to die of poison. After surviving all that chaos, to die from a poisoned goblin arrow. He said that would simply be too boring. Being mocked like this made Brian charge again. Hugo admitted that Brian's loyalty and courage were admirable, but it seemed Brian didn't know his place. Brian tightly gripped his dagger, but with a single sword stroke, without even moving his feet. Hugo knocked the dagger out of Brian's hand. The dagger flew out and stuck in the ground. Hugo asked if he really thought he could fight him with a toy like that. Brian's hand trembled, blood dripped from it. Only then did he realize something. He had become so angry that for a moment he had forgotten how strong this man truly was. Hugo Fagatti, a former lieutenant of Ari from the Empire's most powerful knight order. The Zodiacs, he bore the strange nickname, the maniacal duelist. He earned that name for his fanatical obsession with duels. His obsession was terrifying, even when victory on the battlefield was already guaranteed. He insisted on a duel to the death, one-on-one with the enemy commander to decide the outcome. And the fact that he was still alive today meant he had never lost a single duel. Brian felt completely overwhelmed. Hugo asked him what was wrong. Where had all that earlier momentum gone? Then, to motivate him, Hugo began to tell him a story. He explained that Reynold de Chatelain had injured his left eye. When Reynold stepped forward to protect Brian that day, Reynold had demonstrated extraordinary skill as a swordsman, truly worthy of the title of the Central Kingdom's greatest knight house. Hugo said it had been a magnificent duel. He told Brian that he should have seen the look in Reynold's eyes as the light slowly faded from them when Hugo's sword pierced his heart. He said it was a shame he was the only one who had witnessed it. Then he explained his plan. After killing Brian there, he would head straight to the village and tell the young lady exactly what had happened that day in full detail. And after giving her the antidote, he would ask her for a duel. He imagined the petite lady lunging at him in a fit of rage. He said he would dismember her carefully, as if sculpting a work of art very slowly. Painfully, he laughed and said he found it incredibly amusing. Brian simply said, no. He told Hugo that none of that would happen, because Hugo would die right there at that moment. Brian was filled with rage. Brian lunged at him. He moved incredibly fast. But Hugo stood there calmly. Brian swung his dagger. Hugo seemed bored as he dodged the attack. Then with a casual swing, he slashed Brian's torso, causing blood to splash everywhere. Brian glanced at the wound, but turned his foot and tried to hit Hugo. Hugo swung his sword again and cut Brian's leg. Blood continued to pour. Brian looked at the wound and then stepped back. He was getting angry. He asked Hugo what he was doing. Hugo repeated the question, and then answered as if it were obvious. He said he was just making sure his toy didn't break too soon. That only made Brian angrier, and he called Hugo a sick bastard. Hugo told him to calm down, because he was already starting to lose interest. Anyway, he raised a foot and then swung his sword. Brian was caught off guard. The slash went through his chest. He spat out blood. He couldn't understand how the attack had reached him from so far away. Meanwhile, a rabbit appeared right in front of Ariel. But what caught her attention were the large footprints on the ground. She wondered what kind of monster could have left such large prints, and the trail led directly towards Chiltrock. She wondered if it could be another one of the beast tamer's pets. Still, she thought it would be fine, as the area was guarded by soldiers and hunters. She hurried to find Dan, but something told her that something was wrong. So she decided to deal with the monster first, and ask for reinforcements later. Anyway, she had already lost, so chasing it alone would just be a nuisance. At that moment, Brian was bleeding profusely. Hugo recognized his immense willpower, though it seemed more like suicidal recklessness than true bravery. Since torturing him had lost its appeal, Hugo decided to end it quickly. And painlessly, Brian realized he had been reckless. He had charged in without a plan, fully aware of the huge difference in strength between them. Blinded by rage, he had acted in a way completely alien to his character. The truth was, he had known it from the beginning. He never stood a chance against that monster, and that angered him even more than the enemy in front of him. He hated his own pathetic and powerless self. Hugo calmly said goodbye, but before Hugo could move his arm, something hit him. It was a small pebble. Hugo sharply turned his head to the side. Brian looked towards where it had come from. Dan had thrown it. Hugo was stunned. Blood dripped down his forehead, and his expression twisted in fury. He demanded to know who Dan was. Dan replied that he should be the one asking that. He asked Hugo who he was and why he was trying to kill Brian. Brian yelled at Dan to get out of there and run. That only made Hugo kick him. Brian fell to the ground head first. Dan worried seeing Brian like that. Hugo wiped the blood from his forehead. He was furious that Dan had dared to interrupt his so-called sacred duel. Dan asked him what madness he was talking about, but before he could say anything else, Hugo suddenly moved, lunged at him, and slashed his neck. Fortunately, Dan leaned back at the last second and narrowly dodged it. Hugo was surprised that he had actually dodged it. Dan was annoyed that the guy had attacked him out of nowhere, so he hit back with his bat. Hugo, startled, quickly stepped back. He wondered if it was magic, but knew it wasn't. He couldn't believe that destructive power came solely from pure physical strength. It was enough to make his hands tremble. Seeing that Hugo was going straight for his head from the beginning, Dan knew a peaceful conversation was no longer an option. Hugo noticed Dan's strange weapon and his absurd strength. He commented that Bran had found himself a very interesting friend, and that was perfect because he was just starting to get bored. With a sinister smile, Hugo declared that he wanted to see exactly what Dan was made of. In this story, we follow Dan, a baseball prodigy who seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, until his life changes completely in a single instant. He suddenly finds himself in an unknown world, full of monsters, darkness, and deadly dangers. But even in that terrifying place, there's something that doesn't change: his bat. And it turns out that bat holds a mysterious power capable of crushing the creatures of that other world. What's interesting about this story is how something so everyday for him, like his baseball skill, becomes the key to survival. Each swing is not just an attack. It's as if he's playing the most dangerous game of his life. A game where the prize isn't a trophy, but the chance to return home alive. Now Dan will have to face monsters, discover the origin of that strange power, and find a way back to his world. But tell me something in the comments. If you were in his place, would you rely on a simple bat to survive in a world full of monsters? If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to not miss the next videos. Here we always bring incredible new stories for you. Subscribe to the channel